Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You ready to dive into something kind of wild?
Always up for a good deep dive.
Okay, good, good.
Yeah.
Because today we're talking about, well, sucking carbon out of the air.
Sounds like something straight out of science fiction.
Right, like a giant vacuum cleaner for the planet.
Ah.
But it's real, at least the tech is. And we're talking billions of dollars, some seriously cutting-edge stuff.
Yeah, and it seems like everyone's asking the same question. Can it really work? Like, can we really just suck our way out of this climate mess?
That's the billion-dollar question, right? And not just can it work, but who's going to pay for it? Luckily, we got some pretty interesting insights from this week's readings.
Definitely interesting. Though I gotta say, even for a climate policy wonk like me, a few of these points were, surprising to say the least.
Yeah, tell me about it. Even for a self-proclaimed climate nerd like myself, there were definitely some eye-opening moments in there. But I don't want to spoil the fun just yet. Let's start with the basics. So, what makes this carbon removal thing so different from like all the other climate solutions we hear about?
Well, the way I see it, most climate solutions are about like preventing future emissions, right? Like switching to renewable energy or driving electric cars. But carbon removal, that's about cleaning up the mess we've already made.
So it's not just about like stopping the bleeding, it's about what transfusing some clean air back into the atmosphere.
Exactly. It's a totally different approach.
Okay, I'm with you so far. And it seems like the US government is, well, pretty serious about this whole thing. I mean, they're throwing a cool $3.5 billion at what they're calling direct air capture technology.
Yeah, direct air capture, or DI for short. It's basically giant industrial scale plants that, well, they essentially suck CO2 straight out of the air.
Like millions of tons, right?
Billions even, if they work as planned.
Wow. Okay, billions. That's, yeah, ambitious is an understatement.
Right.
But that's where my inner skeptic starts to pipe up. It all sounds great in theory, but like, is it just a high-tech fantasy? Can we really build our way out of this climate crisis?
Ah, see, you're hitting on one of the biggest concerns raised by Breakthrough Energy, one of the groups we read about. Building the plants, that's just step one. The real challenge, they say, is demand.
Demand, you mean like who's going to buy all that captured carbon?
Exactly.
Oh,
Imagine building a factory that churns out something nobody wants. Except in this case, that something is, well, a cleaner planet.
it's like we're solving a problem that ideally should be free,
Right.
right? Like, shouldn't everyone want a cleaner planet?
In a perfect world, sure. But the economics of it are tricky. And that's where that whole Solyndra comparison comes in.
Solyndra, oh, right. That solar panel company the government pumped billions into, right?
Yeah.
Yep. And it went belly up. The market just wasn't there. The timing wasn't right. And boom, billions down the drain. Breakthrough Energy is basically saying we could be headed down that same road with direct air capture if we're not careful.
So how do we avoid a repeat of, well, of history this time? Because let's be real, the stakes are even higher now.
Well, that's where things get really interesting. One radical idea is that the government becomes the buyer of last resort. They'd buy the captured carbon themselves.
Wait, so instead of companies buying carbon offsets, the government just like buys clean air.
Basically, it sounds kind of wild, right? But there's a logic to it.
Okay, I'm all ears. Lay it on me.
Think of it like other public goods. Clean water, public parks. We all benefit, so we invest in them collectively. A stable climate, that's kind of the ultimate public good, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can't really put a price tag on a livable planet, can you? Okay, yeah, I can kind of see that. But even if we go with this whole government as buyer idea, we got to talk about the elephant in the room, which is like the cost. How much are we talking here, realistically? We'll buckle up because the numbers are pretty astronomical, to say the least. One of the groups we looked at, BCG, a consulting firm, did some number crunching. They figured that even at a low price of like $100 per ton of CO2, if we're talking about capturing the billions of tons that scientists say we need to.
Yeah, to actually make a dent in climate change.
Right, right. We'd be looking at, get this, $1 trillion annual bill.
$1 trillion
Yeah.
every year. Oh, okay, yeah, astronomical is definitely the right word. That's more than we spend on like a lot of things here in the US. Hold on though, because in the stuff we read, didn't it say that some companies are already buying carbon removal credits? Like Microsoft, Stripe, those guys. Isn't that a sign that like the market is starting to work?
Right.
Maybe the government doesn't have to foot the whole bill.
True. There's definitely some early activity in the market, and that's got to be encouraging, right? But, and this is where it gets a little concerning. The data from, let me see, CDR, not AFI, they track these purchases, and their data shows a kind of worrying trend. Yeah, see, while the total amount of money being spent on carbon removal, that's going up, which is good, but the number of new buyers, that's actually shrinking.
So it's the same, like handful of companies carrying the weight. That doesn't seem very sustainable, does it? Not if we're talking about the kind of scale we need to, really move the needle on climate change.
That's the worry, exactly. And it gets even more, well, lopsided when you look at the details. Do you know that Microsoft, they're responsible for over 77% of all carbon removal purchases just this year?
Seriously, 77%. That's insane. It's like we're relying on like a handful of corporate philanthropists when what we really need is like a whole system overhaul. But okay, if these big companies are already investing, why aren't others jumping on board?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting, believe it or not. You see, direct air capture, it's not the only game in town. It's got some competition, especially from something called the voluntary carbon market.
Ah, right. The voluntary carbon market. Yeah, that was mentioned in the research, but I got to admit, I kind of skimmed over that part. How does that whole thing work again?
So it's a little complicated, but basically it lets companies offset their emissions by investing in like projects that reduce or remove CO2 somewhere else.
Okay,
Could be anything from planting trees to protecting forests or, yeah, even funding those direct air capture plants we talked about.
got it.
Companies, they buy these credits that represent like a certain amount of CO2 captured or avoided, and then they use those credits to, on paper at least, balance out their own carbon footprint.
So it's kind of like a way for them to, what, balance their carbon checkbooks. They keep emitting, but they're also investing in removing those emissions elsewhere. Sounds like a decent idea in theory, but I remember the research hinting that there are some issues with this market, right?
Right. You got to be careful with these things. One of the biggest problems is the price difference. You see, you've got guaranteed carbon removal, like what you get with a direct air capture plant, and then you've got all these other carbon offset projects.
And I'm guessing planting trees is a lot cheaper than building a giant, air purifier.
You got it. And while those nature-based solutions are super important, don't get me wrong, their effectiveness as like carbon offsets, well, that can be really hard to measure, to verify. There have been concerns about whether they're actually delivering the carbon reductions they promise, transparency issues, even cases of, well, outright fraud.
Wow, really? Okay, so let me get this straight. A company, they want the cheapest, easiest way to offset their emissions,
Yeah.
right? They might be tempted to just buy a bunch of tree planting credits, even if those credits are, well, let's just say a little less than legit.
Exactly. And that creates this dilemma. Because even though direct air capture might be the better solution in the long run, more effective, it's also way more expensive. And in the business world, well, we know every penny counts. That price difference, it can be a deal breaker.
So we're back to square one, aren't we? How do we convince companies to choose the pricier option, even if it's the one that might actually, make a real difference? How do we keep this carbon removal thing from becoming just another box to tick on a corporate sustainability report?
It's a tough one, no doubt. But one thing's for sure, somebody's got to pay for all this.
And that brings us right back to that trillion-dollar question, doesn't it? If we're serious about cleaning up this mess, who foots the bill? Is it taxpayers? Is it corporations? Or is it some, like, tag team effort? It's tough. I mean, part of me thinks, well, these companies, a lot of them, they got rich off the stuff that caused this whole climate mess. Shouldn't they be the ones paying to clean it up?
Yeah, there's a certain logic to that for sure.
But then the other side of my brain is like, wait, this is a global problem. It affects everyone. Shouldn't taxpayers have a say in how we deal with it?
Yeah.
Especially we're talking about like spending trillions of dollars,
It's
right?
a classic ethical dilemma, isn't it? And I don't think there's an easy answer. Honestly, as these carbon removal technologies, as they get better, more affordable, that debate, who pays? It's only going to get more intense.
Yeah, it feels like we're at this like crossroads. We know we got to get that CO2 out of the atmosphere, billions of tons of it if we want to like avoid the worst of climate change. But how we do it, who pays? Man, that could make or break this whole carbon removal thing.
Couldn't agree more. It's a conversation that's got to happen, but not just, in some fancy boardroom or government meeting. It's got to happen everywhere, around dinner tables, online, you name it. Because at the end of the day, whether this carbon removal thing works, whether we tackle this climate crisis, it depends on people being informed, engaged, and demanding action. So true. We can't just sit back and hope for the best or assume some, like, magical tech fix is going to fall out of the sky. We got to be in the game. Learning, asking questions, having those tough conversations about the costs, who's responsible, what really matters.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The future of the planet. We might just depend on it.
All right, on that note, we got to wrap up, but we want to leave you with something to think about. Today, we learned that this carbon removal tech, it's got potential, right? Could be a game changer. But it's not some magic bullet. It's pricey, it's complicated, and it brings up some really thorny questions about what's right, what's fair. So here's your food for thought. If we're serious about using this tech, about cleaning up our mess, are we willing to do what it takes? And I mean that financially, sure, but also as a society.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Something to chew on, for sure. Until next time, keep learning, keep digging for those answers. We'll see you all on the next Deep Dive.